Thank you. Oh, Giada. Uh-oh.
Hello.
Hi. Hello. There we go. All of a sudden, I noticed that the internet, I can't find them come out of the computer, so that could have been tragic.
Okay, okay.
All right. Okay. Great. Well, let me do an introduction, and then off we go. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and for today or this week's Chautauqua series, Theme Week, Latin America Labor and Migration Conditions. And for today, we're fortunate to have Giada Fiorucci joining us. Giada is a PhD candidate in Media Studies at the Western University in London, Ontario. She holds a bachelor's degree in Economic Development and International Cooperation from the University of Florence, Italy, and a master's degree in International Relations from Aarhus University in Denmark, where she focused on the human right to water. And today's presentation is Flowing Together, Uniting El Salvador and Michigan in the Fight for Water Justice. And in this presentation, Giada will delve into the interconnected struggles for water justice in El Salvador and Michigan. By drawing parallels and framing the issues within a broader context, we can inspire a collaborative movement to defend water. I do ask if you please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Giada Federici.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, John. And good morning and welcome everyone. So I'll turn off my camera, just said it yesterday. And thank you once again for joining me today. I'm Giada Ferrucci, as I was just said. And I'm excited to delve into another crucial issue today, one that once again transcends borders. That is water justice. Yesterday, we started discussing solidarity and citizen activism from American citizens and the Central American diaspora, particularly toward Guatemala and El Salvador. Today, we'll still explore two case studies, and the striking parallels this time are between water justice cases in El Salvador, once again object of analysis, and Flint in Michigan, as they confront really huge challenges when it comes to their water rights. In both regions, industrial pollution, inadequate infrastructure, and corporate interests have placed the fundamental right to clean water under threat. In El Salvador, local communities have rallied against transnational mining corporations that exploit water resources, resulting in both water pollution and scarcity. Similarly, in Michigan, the Flint water crisis brought to light the devastating consequences of industrial practices on water quality and public health. But drawing these parallels, I wish to highlight universal struggles for water justice and underscore the urgent need for collaborative action. So the discussion today, flowing together, um, will highlight both shared challenges and frameworks for a united movement to defend water as a fundamental human right. Together, we can discuss policies that prioritize community well-being, environmental sustainability, and corporate accountability as well. So, delving into these interconnected struggles in El Salvador and Michigan, I'm interested to examine how these communities are mobilizing to safeguard their water resources. And by framing this issue within a broader context, the discussion really include reflections on collective action and dialogue that transcend geographic boundaries and artificial borders. Once again, thank you so much for your attention today as we talk about water justice in El Salvador and in Michigan. So just a brief outline of my presentation, which will begin by introducing the importance of water justice as a concept and framework, especially in El Salvador and Michigan. I will also highlight the relevance of comparing these two locations despite their extremely different contexts. Then I'll briefly define water justice and its significance for communities and the environment. In terms of context and background, I will then provide an overview of water justice issues in El Salvador due to the impact of transnational mining corporations on water resources, as well as the case of the Flint water crisis and its impact on community health and safety. In the comparative analysis, I will highlight dimensions such as industrial pollution, inadequate infrastructure, and corporate interest. In terms of shared challenges and universal issues, I will discuss in both cases features concerning environmental and health impacts and community mobilization. Toward the end of the talk today, I will spend some time discussing the importance of a framework for a united fight, building, for example, solidarity through collaborative strategies and inspiration for action. Finally, just as yesterday, I will also review the main points discussed in today's talk. So once again, thank you so much for your attention. So let's start with the importance of water justice, a critical aspect of environmental and human rights advocacy, emphasizing equitable access to clean and safe water for all communities for the following reasons. There's human rights. Access to clean water is a fundamental human right, essential for health, survival, and dignity. Water justice then ensures that this right is upheld for all individuals, regardless of socioeconomic status or geographic location. Public health. Contaminated water sources can lead to serious health issues, including waterborne diseases and long term chronic conditions. Ensuring water justice helps prevent this health risk and promote overall community well being. Environmental sustainability. Sustainable management of water resources is crucial for maintaining ecological balance. Water justice advocates for practices that protect water sources from pollution and overexploitation, supporting the health of ecosystems. Social equity. Water justice addresses disparities in access to clean water, particularly in marginalized and vulnerable communities. It seeks to rectify historical and systemic inequalities that have led to disproportionate impacts on certain populations. Economic impact. Reliable access to clean water is vital for economic activities such as agriculture, industry, and daily living. Water justice supports economic stability and development by ensuring that water resources are managed fairly and sustainably. Indeed, water justice involves the fair and equitable distribution and management of water resources. It encompasses several dimensions: equitable access, ensuring that all individuals, especially those in disadvantaged or marginalized communities, have access to clean, safe, and affordable water. Protection, and this is going to be a really key issue highlighted in the discussion today. Protection of water resources, it means advocating for the preservation and protection of natural water sources from contamination and depletion, including addressing industrial pollution and unsustainable practices. Community participation, again, is a fundamental element as in involving local communities in decision-making processes related to water management allows them to have a voice in policies that affect their water resources. Accountability and transparency, holding corporations, governments, and other entities accountable for their impact on water resources is also crucial. This includes advocating for transparent practices and addressing corruption or mismanagement. And finally, education and advocacy as promoting awareness and understanding of water issues through education and advocacy effort include raising awareness about the importance of water justice and mobilizing communities to take action. So once again, I used a similar thing as yesterday, or cloud. The one I'm showing today encapsulates the key themes and concepts associated with water justice in the context of our discussion. Once again, the size of each word reflects its frequency and significance in the discourse on grassroots efforts and human rights movements for water justice. Overall, water justice seeks to create a world where everyone has fair access to clean and safe water, where water resources are managed sustainably, and where the rights and needs of all communities are respected and protected. So, connected to the topic of discussion today, the case studies of El Salvador and Flint, Michigan, water crises exemplify the critical importance of water justice, revealing the impacts of industrial pollution, infrastructure failures, and governance issues. These cases underscore the need for equitable access to clean water, sustainable resource management, and robust mechanisms for holding responsible parties accountable. By examining these interconnected struggles, we can better understand the broader implications of water justice and advocate for systemic changes that protect water resources and public health worldwide. So, working with a relatively straightforward definition of water justice, it is the fair and equitable distribution of water resources, access to clean and safe drinking water, and the right of all people to participate in decision making processes related to water management. It involves addressing issues of inequality, pollution, and governance to ensure that water is managed in a way that respects both human rights and environmental sustainability. So, in terms of the relevance of water justice, especially for human communities worldwide, as we just said, water is a basic human need. Access to clean water is essential for life and health. Proper management of water resources helps also protect ecosystems, maintain biodiversity, and ensure the long term availability of water for future generations within the framework of environmental sustainability. Contaminated water sources, as we'll see very clearly in the case studies presented today, can lead to a range of health issues. And so, water justice here really aims to prevent health disparities. And as we know, in terms of economic development, access to water is critical for many sectors, such as agriculture, industry, and economic development in general. And so it is really important to support and ensure water justice because it can contribute to sustainable economic growth and resilience. And as specific to to both case studies that we look at today, in terms of social equity, addressing historical and systemic inequalities related to water access and pollution help promote social equity and just justice. So, before we dive in the case studies described today in El Salvador and Flint, Michigan, just a few statistics of relevance on global water issues to set the stage of our discussion. So in terms of global water scarcity, 1.2 billion people lack access to clean drinking water in the world, with 2.2 billion people lacking access to safely managed drinking water services. In terms of water stress, approximately 4 billion people experience severe water scarcity for at least 1 month a year. And so all this data is from the UN and it's 2020 to 2022, so relatively recent. In terms of water pollution, what are we discussing here? 80% of wastewater worldwide is released into the environment without adequate treatment, leading to severe water pollution. 2 million people die each year from diseases related to unsafe water sanitation and hygiene, according to the World Health Organization in a statement released in 2022. So again, most of the data used also was emerging during the pandemic, and so also the research context is particularly interested considering the massive use of water to comply with health guidelines. What about the impact on ecosystems then? As you can see here, fresh ecosystems, over 50% of the world's wetland have been lost in the last century, impacting both the biodiversity and ecosystem services. But also an important feature to mention is overexploitation. Aquifers are being depleted faster than they can be replenished in many regions, leading to long-term water shortages. Of course, a discussion on water scarcity, contamination cannot be possible without also discussion on climate change and the relationship it has with water in terms of increased frequency of extreme weather Climate change is leading to more frequent and severe droughts and floods affecting water availability and quality. And this is especially true in the case of El Salvador, as we'll see in a few minutes. And of course, another element of discussion is important to add in this context is the rising sea level issues, where saltwater intrusion into freshwater sources due to rising sea levels impacts drinking water and agriculture in coastal areas. And finally, the last numbers that I think are always important to include to give a broader context of what we're dealing with in terms of water issues, water crisis, but also water justice, the economic impact and the water scarcity costs. The global economic cost of water scarcity is estimated to be over $500 billion annually due to the impact on agriculture, industry, and health. And so at this point, we have a bit of a broader overview about the context of water justice. So let's dive in and discuss water issues in El Salvador. In El Salvador, mining corporations, object of discussion today, have caused severe damage to water resources, leading to both pollution and scarcity. Local communities have mobilized against these corporate giants, as I will highlight, fighting for their right to clean and accessible water. So looking at El Salvador as a country, as we all probably know, it is a very small one in Central America with a tropical climate, abundant rainfall, and significant river systems, including the Lempa River, which you can see over here. This is the Lempa River. Despite this, water scarcity persists due to pollution and poor infrastructure. Contamination from mining, starting in the early 2000s, and inadequate water management systems have created a paradox where abundant rainfall does not ensure clean or accessible water for all in El Salvador. In terms of the socioeconomic context, the country faces significant challenges, including poverty, high levels of inequality, and underdeveloped infrastructure. These issues exacerbate water access and management problems, so that many residents have to rely on expensive bottled water or travel long distance to access clean water, further straining their economic resources. And as we were discussing yesterday during my presentation, this is of course also one of the leading causes that explain why so many Central Americans keep migrating to the US. They are part of those caravans that we've been seeing that they walk across borders. Oftentimes they escape poverty, and this poverty is also caused by the environmental resources that are depleted by climate change, of course, but also by industrial misuses, I should say. The complex interplay of environmental degradation, socioeconomic factors, and community activism in the struggle for water justice in El Salvador are crucial to highlight in the discussion today. So, I want to talk particularly about the rise of transnational mining corporations, particularly Canadian firms, and the way it has led to extensive water pollution and depletion in El Salvador. The mining extraction process, especially for gold, involves, for example, cyanide and other toxic chemicals that contaminate water resources. So despite having abundant rainfall, this doesn't really help if on the ground transnational mining companies are not releasing their mining waste correctly, and so their work and their exploitation of water have led to severe water scarcity issues. And unfortunately, mining it is also a very water-intensive industry, to the point that in El Salvador nowadays, approximately 90% of surface water is contaminated due to industrial waste and inadequate sewage treatment alike. Water services are also inconsistent, with frequent interruptions and high cost, particularly affecting low-income communities. In El Salvador, then, it's quite clear that mining corporations have significantly damaged water resources, leading to pollution and scarcity. Despite abundant rainfall and river systems like the Lempa River, water scarcity persists. The socioeconomic challenges I mentioned before, including poverty, high inequality, and undeveloped infrastructure, worsen these problems. And as such, it is fascinating to see how local communities have mobilized to combat the negative impacts of mining on water resources. And in El Salvador, being a water right activist is kind of the same as saying being an anti-mining activist because the two causes, the two campaigns, the two mobilization are very similar in their demands as mining is a water intensive industry. So grassroots organizations have led protests, legal battles, and awareness campaigns to hold corporations accountable and push for sustainable water management. Another world case involves the Canadian mining company Pacific Rim, which began operations in Cabañas in 2002, and the permit in El Salvador that shares a border with Honduras. As mining activities increased in the area, concern over environmental damage and health impacts grew, leading local activists like Marcelo Miguel Rivera, along with the Association for Economic and Social Development, ADES, to protest and campaign against the company. Activists like them highlighted the threats to water resources due to mining, and despite the risk, local groups continue their advocacy, to this day, I should say, using legal and grassroots strategies to demand justice. Activism here was driven by community members' testimonies about health and water source impacts from mining. Contaminated water, in fact, had led to increased waterborne diseases in the area, forcing residents to rely on alternatives such as expensive bottled water, as I said before, or travel long distances for clean water, which strain their already limited resources. A pivotal moment in this particular community in the department of Cabañas occurred with the murder of Marcelo Rivera in 2009, believed to be linked to his activism. This tragedy intensified opposition and drew international attention to the issue, highlighting the dangerous intersection of environmental activism, community resistance against corporations, and the violent repercussions faced by activists. And he was among the first to be killed, but there were other three activists, anti-mining activists from the area that were subsequently killed. And so advocacy groups have pushed for stricter environmental regulations and better enforcement of existing laws. Successes included temporary bans on certain mining activities and increased scrutiny of new projects. And international organizations and NGOs have supported local efforts, providing resources and bringing global attention to El Salvador water crisis. So this context is really fascinating because it underscores the complex interplay of environmental degradation, socioeconomic factors, and community activism in the fight for water justice in El Salvador. There's been an overwhelming public opposition to mining in the country, driven by concerns about water contamination and environmental damage, as many Salvadorans believe the mining is inappropriate given the country's small size and ecological sensitivity. For example, the National Roundtable Against Metallic Mining, formed in 2005, has been a coalition of different NGOs, organizations, local communities, pivotal in advocating for a legislative ban on mining and addressing related issues. After decades of struggles, on March 29, 2017, El Salvador became the first country to ban all metallic mining, a significant victory for environmental and community activists. Despite this success, the country continued to face severe water stress and pollution from other industries, for example, the sugarcane monocrop, as well as infrastructure issues. So the continuing presence of non-metallic mining and other industries, the debate over water privatization as well. As you can see here, the banner that says water is ours, not of private enterprises. So these debates reflect ongoing complexities in achieving comprehensive water justice. So let's travel a lot closer to where you are in Michigan, where the Flint water crisis has underscored the impact of industrial negligence and infrastructure failure on water quality. The Flint water crisis is also one of the most stark examples of systemic failures in managing public health and infrastructure. The crisis unfolded when the city of Flint switched its water supply to the Flint River in 2014, so 10 years ago, as a cost-saving measure. This crisis has brought to light issues of systemic injustice and also mobilized communities to demand change. Michigan, located in the Great Lakes region, is known for its abundant freshwater resources. However, socioeconomic disparities and infrastructural issues have led to significant water challenges in various communities. A well-known crisis, the Flint example, began when the water supply was switched from the Detroit system to the Flint River to cut costs, and the lack of proper corrosion control led to lead contamination, exposing residents to severe health risks and highlighting systemic issues of environmental and racial injustice. So the Flint water crisis, beginning 10 years ago, is a well-known case, of course. Again, the Flint water treatment plan was ill-prepared to treat the river's water, leading to a series of critical oversights. One of the key failures that I mentioned before was the lack of necessary corrosion controls, which allowed the river water to corrode the pipes. As a result, lead and other contaminants leached into the water supply, causing widespread health issues among residents. For example, the community quickly noticed false smelling, discolored water, and began reporting health problems. Tests revealed elevated levels of lead in the blood of many children, leading to long-term health risks. And in addition to these, harmful bacteria such as E. coli and Legionella were also detected in the water. The response from government officials was a bit slow and inadequate, we could almost say, exacerbating the water crisis. Residents kept facing numerous health issues, including skin rashes, hair loss, and more serious conditions like developmental problems in children, and even increased risk of kidney and liver damage. So the crisis highlighted systemic failures in infrastructure management and government oversight, sparking widespread outrage and legal action. The Flint water crisis served as a stark reminder of the importance of proper water treatment and the dire consequences of neglecting public health safeguards. The long-term effects on Flint residents continue to be a subject of concern and study as their city works to rebuild trust in its water supply. So despite mounting complaints, state officials initially dismissed these concerns and assured residents that the water was safe to drink. For over a year, state officials failed to take adequate action to address the growing crisis, and it wasn't until external investigation and extensive media coverage exposed the severity of contamination that the issue was acknowledged. In January 2016, the state declared a state of emergency, and efforts to mitigate the crisis began, including distributing bottled water and water filters to residents. Legal actions were taken against officials responsible for the crisis, and the Flint water crisis emerged as a stark symbol of environmental injustice. So here is a close-up to show how the water crisis in Flint began in April 2014 with the switch of water supply from the Detroit system to the Flint River to save costs, as I said before. And so this critical oversight is quite evident even in this picture, which shows how the lack of necessary corrosion control allowed the river water to corrode lead pipes. And so the widespread health issues among residents were among the most important consequences, of course. But again, it's an interesting case study to analyze and understand as advocates and researchers like Dr. Mona Hanatisha played crucial roles in uncovering and addressing the crisis, emphasizing the need for justice and accountability. So, this particular crisis, the water crisis of Flint, Michigan, highlighted many long-term effects that continue to be a subject of concern and study, and also this particular case help us consider dimensions such as the necessary emphasis and the need for comprehensive policies and accountability to protect vulnerable communities from similar crises in the future. So this is also thinking, for example, on the connections. So how The water crisis in El Salvador and Flint, Michigan, while geographically very distinct, reveal profound connections in their underlying causes and impacts, illustrating broader issues related to water justice. In both El Salvador and Michigan, issues of industrial pollution, infrastructure failures, and inadequate government response reveal a broader global pattern of water justice challenges. By examining these parallels, we can better understand the systemic nature of environmental injustice affecting communities worldwide. So, first, I want to think about dimensions of connections and broader implications. Both in El Salvador and Flint, Michigan, both cases show how industrial pollution and infrastructure failures can lead to a severe water crisis, exacerbated by inadequate government response. In both regions, the failure to address contamination and maintain infrastructure reveals a broader global pattern of environmental injustice that disproportionately affect vulnerable communities. Case also demonstrate how systemic issues, whether related to industry practice, infrastructure management, or government oversight, contribute to water crises worldwide. And so, beginning to think about this worldwide scale, in terms of global pattern of water justice challenges, the similarities between these crises also underscore the systemic nature of environmental injustices. They reveal how water issues are not confined to specific regions, but are part of a larger global challenge. By analyzing these parallels, we gain insight into the universal nature of water justice issues and the need for comprehensive, collaborative solutions to address the root causes of water pollution and infrastructure failures. Understanding these connections help to highlight the importance of global solidarity, which I'll detail in a few minutes, and share strategies in advocating for water justice. By learning from each other's experience and working together, communities can develop more effective responses to water crises and advocate for systemic changes that promote environmental sustainability and social equity. So diving in more closely, let's see what are the connections. In terms of industrial pollution and environmental exploitation, as I said before, in El Salvador, transnational mining corporations have significantly impacted water resources through practices that led to pollution and scarcity. Mining activities, because of their extractive method, have contaminated rivers and also groundwater, threatening the health and livelihoods of local communities. Oftentimes, an issue discussed is that there is no prior consultation with local communities to ask for their consent and support for a mining project. And so this lack of consultation is a really key issue that unfortunately does not only characterize the context of El Salvador and its mining impacted communities. And in Flint, Michigan, in terms of industrial pollution and environmental exploitation, this crisis stemmed from the contamination of the city water supply, which led due to inadequate treatment and the use of corrosive water from the Flint River. Industrial and government negligence contributed to this crisis, revealing how industrial practices can indeed harm water quality. What about then inadequate infrastructure? What is in common between the two case studies? Many communities, in fact, in El Salvador face challenges related to inadequate water infrastructure exacerbated by the lack of investment and maintenance. This leads to limited access to clean water and increased vulnerability, not only due to pollution, but also due to the fact that the infrastructure is quite aged and not very cost effective. And also, many spills are a frequent occurrence. So, the waste of water is a systemic issue that also is echoed in the case of the Flint crisis, which highlights severe deficiencies in water infrastructure and management. The decision to switch water sources without proper treatment led to the corrosion of lead pipes, contaminated water supply, and exposing systemic infrastructure failures. In terms of corporate and government accountability, then, the involvement of multinational corporations, transnational mining firms in El Salvador water crisis raises issues of accountability and environmental justice. So efforts by local communities to hold these entities accountable underscore the need for corporate responsibility in water management. And El Salvador became very famous actually in 2016 when he won demands against a mining company, Pacific Rim slash OceanaGold, that was suing El Salvador because he had temporarily suspended its mining project. Again, concern for water issues in this case, thanks to the strong commitment of water activists, were addressed in a legal court. And so, similarly, the Flint water crisis brought attention to the role of government negligence and the need for accountability, as both local and state officials faced criticism for their failure to act and protect public health. Whenever it comes to health and social impact, we already described in length the pollution of water resources in El Salvador as the causes of health problems such as kidney disease and other waterborne illnesses, which of course reduce quality of life and economic and affect worsen economic hardship for mining affected communities. And the contamination in Flint similarly resulted in widespread health issues, including lead poisoning, developmental problems in children, but also this crisis highlighted racial and economic disparities, as Flint's predominantly black and low income residents were disproportionately affected. And finally, grassroots movements and local organizations in El Salvador have mobilized to resist the environmental degradation caused by mining activities, advocating for their right to clean water and environmental protection, just like it happened in Flint, Michigan, where activist advocacy groups, but also residents, indeed convene and join a resistance, highlighting the power of community mobilization in addressing water justice issues. So, in this context, then, it is quite interesting to compare industrial activities causing water issues in both regions. With El Salvador also, because we're mostly talking about rural communities where mining projects are located, agricultural runoff is also a source of concern, as intensive agricultural practices, particularly in sugarcane cultivation, as I mentioned before, contribute to high levels of agrochemical runoff, and this runoff, unfortunately, it contaminates water sources with pesticides and fertilizers. On top of that, mining activities and mining operations such as gold and silver extraction, as I said before, introduce heavy metals and toxic substances into local water systems, exacerbating pollution. And in terms of factory discharges, industrial processes in manufacturing and processing plants release pollutants directly into rivers and lakes, impacting water quality. In terms of industrial discharges in Michigan and in the Flint case in particular, historical ongoing industrial activities, including automotive and manufacturing plants, have led to significant water pollution through direct discharge of chemicals and heavy metals. Similar to El Salvador, agricultural activities also are a contributing factor, particularly in rural areas, as they contribute to pollution of water bodies. In terms of industrialized areas and former sites of heavy manufacturing, such as in Flint, they're also marked by legacy pollution, including lead and other contaminants. So, what about the environmental and health impacts? So, again, in terms of connection, we have already discussed how the exposure to agrochemicals and heavy metals has been linked to chronic kidney disease, respiratory problems, and other health issues among communities near polluted water resources, for example, in El Salvador. And contaminated water affects, of course, the health of residents, but above all, it also affects local ecosystems, harming aquatic life and reducing biodiversity. So polluted rivers and lakes impact both agriculture and local livelihoods. In Michigan, health issues, as we mentioned before, particularly affecting children, do not only stop, of course, in the urban area of Flint. The extension is much larger, as other areas affected by industrial pollution also face similar health risks. And in terms of pollution from industrial sources, which has led to also habitat destruction in Flint, Michigan, naturally, it also contributed to reduce water quality in rivers and lakes, and of course, contaminated water affects recreational activities as well as local economics, local ecosystems. So, in terms of examining, for example, the role of infrastructure failures and government negligence in both cases, this also highlights similarities in how both communities have been affected by inadequate response. So, by exploring these parallels, let's talk about, for example, El Salvador. And again, many water systems in the country are outdated, as I mentioned before, and poorly maintained, leading to frequent failures and contamination. And of course, there are limited water treatment facilities, which contribute to the pollution of water sources, as I showed you in a few pictures before. Similarly, in Michigan, we're talking more about cracked and old pipes. Again, these aging lead pipes that were inadequately prepared to handle the switch in water sources led to the severe contamination that characterized the Flint water crisis. And so, this lack of equipment, how was it addressed then by the government response, which at times has been more like characterized by a certain degree of negligence. For example, in El Salvador, we're thinking more about delayed response. Government response to water pollution crises are in fact often slow by limited actions taken to address the root causes or to provide adequate relief to affected communities. And many communities also struggle to hold polluting industries accountable. And so, water extraction, for example, by water plants, is something they have a hard time challenging. They organize rally, protest, marches, press conferences, of course, but it's not always easy to fight Goliath. That's oftentimes the comparison that they use. Local communities being David and transnational mining companies being Goliath. And similarly, in Michigan, we're talking more about the use of emergency managers in Flint, which bypassed local governance and accountability, leading to poor decision making and inadequate responses to the crisis, as well as delayed actions, which state officials were slow to acknowledge and address the severity of the Flint water contamination, leading to prolonged exposure and health impacts. Efforts to address the crisis were often reactive rather than proactive. So, by comparing the struggle faced by communities in El Salvador and Michigan, we can see how industrial pollution, infrastructure failures, and government responses contribute to broader water justice issues. These parallels not only underscore the systemic nature of environmental injustice, they also highlight the need for global solutions that address both local and international water justice challenges. So across both regions, then, local activists are leading the charge for water justice. And this is how I wanted to connect to the discussion I shared with you yesterday on solidarity, because the stories of these local activists, but also residents, are of resilience and resistance, and they offer valuable lessons and inspiration for others facing similar challenges. Local activists in both El Salvador and Michigan are in fact playing a crucial role in the fight for water justice, and their the resilience provide valuable insight and inspiration. And so I really want to focus on their efforts and achievement in this section of the discussion. And so again, what are the grassroots movements and local initiatives involved in El Salvador to begin with? We have the Water Forum, Foro del Agua, a coalition of social organizations, unions, and communities groups that have been instrumental in advocating for water rights and environmental justice in the country. This forum, Foro del Agua, organized various protests, educational campaigns, and legal action to highlight the impacts of water pollution and to demand government accountability and better water management policies. Their efforts have been pivotal in raising public awareness and pushing for legislative reforms to protect water resources. Then we also have the Mesa Nacional Frente a la Minería Metálica, National Roundtable Against Metallic Mining, which comprises various environmental, community, and religious organizations united in their opposition to mining activities that threaten water resources. The coalition successfully campaigned for a historic ban on metal mining in El Salvador, enacted in 2007, and it's been a really crucial coalition safeguarding water resources from contamination and ensuring long-term environmental sustainability in the country. We also have a few more organizations, como Fundasal, which is the Foundation for the Development of El Salvador, MODAT, the Movement for the Defense of Water and Territory, and finally CESDE, the Study Research Center for Development. All these organizations have been, in their own way, instrumental in advocating for improved water management practices and environmental justice by lobbying for policy changes and raising awareness about the impact of industrial pollution as they continue to push for sustainable development practices and community rights. And in particular, the Centro de Estudios para el Desarrollo CESDE, so Research Center for Development, uses reports that have informed policy discussion and community actions. So, what about the side of Flint, Michigan? How do grassroots movements and local initiatives look like? For example, the grassroots group Flint Residents for Public Education focus on advocating for the rights of Flint residents affected by the water crisis. They work to ensure that local schools receive necessary resources and support for children impacted by lead poisoning. Also the Coalition Michigan Environmental Justice, MEJC, which brings together communities across Michigan to address environmental justice issues, and they focus on advocating for policy changes, environmental health, and the protection of vulnerable communities. Finally, the grassroots organization We the People of Michigan addresses water justice and public health issues through community organizing and advocacy. They mobilize local residents to demand cleaner water and better government accountability. And in terms of key organizations and achievement, for example, the Flint Water Advisory Task Force was formed in response to the Flint water crisis, and this task force also included community members and experts who work to provide recommendations for improving water safety and infrastructure. Their efforts have led to increased funding for water infrastructure, upgrades, and public health initiatives. The Michigan League of Conservation Water also has been vocal advocate for water protection policies and has successfully pushed for legislation to improve water quality and hold polluters accountable. And by sharing strategies and supporting one another, both communities in El Salvador and Michigan can then advocate for policies that prioritize community well-being and environmental sustainability. So, in advocating for this policy and sharing strategies, supporting each other, I wish in the next segment to explore a little more the lesson that can be learned from both water crises in Flint, Michigan and Cabañas, El Salvador, while also illustrating the universal challenges and solutions in the fight for water justice. So, community resilience, for example, in terms of lessons from El Salvador to Michigan, again, the El Salvador grassroots movements emphasize the importance of community resilience and mobilization in the face of environmental justice. Again, it is a dimension that is shared in both cases, but really it's interesting to also see how Salvadoran initiatives often integrate local and indigenous knowledge into their advocacy work. So perhaps even this idea of incorporating traditional ecological knowledge and engaging with indigenous leaders for a more holistic approach to water justice could be interesting to explore further. And in terms of legal and policy advocacy, El Salvador organization successfully lobbied for policy changes and legal reforms, as I mentioned before, especially through the mining ban. And so again, this is a really important learning experience that can happen. At the same time, in terms of public awareness campaign, the emphasis that Michigan communities placed on public awareness and education campaigns has helped highlight water justices. Similarly, the collaboration with scientists and experts have proved valuable insight and support for advocacy efforts. And finally, Michigan organizations, as the one I mentioned before, have developed really interesting and effective strategies to mobilize resource and funding. So again, discussing how these ideas are applicable to the context of El Salvador, as both areas have faced significant challenges in securing safe and clean water due to industrial pollution, infrastructure failures, and so despite these obstacles, thinking about grassroots movements and local initiatives in both areas, how they made substantial strides in advocating for water justice, yes, we must recognize the historical context and ongoing efforts in environmental justice, but we can also draw valuable lessons for supporting and amplifying both water justice efforts through, for example, opportunities for collaboration, such as joint advocacy campaign to amplify both voices of the communities in El Salvador and Michigan on global water justice issues by highlighting common struggles. They can gain greater visibility and support from international audiences. Also, knowledge exchange programs, establishing, for example, exchange programs or builder forums where activists from both regions can share their experience, strategies, and challenges, which can foster mutual learning and strengthen their activist efforts, and shared research initiatives, as collaborating on research projects that address water justice issues in both regions can provide valuable insight and support evidence-based advocacy. In terms of, again, amplifying each other's efforts, solidarity actions such as global awareness events or coordinated campaigns can show support for each other's causes and draw attention to water justice issues across different regions. Cross-regional partnerships are also an interesting example as between organizations, for example, in El Salvador and Michigan, can help leverage strengths and resources, facilitate exchange of skills, knowledge, and best practices. And finally, through mutual support networks and collaboration, this also is necessary to provide ongoing assistance, but also encouragement, as the fight for water justice is not an easy one. And so, as I'm leading toward the end of my talk, I just want to briefly talk about how the struggle for water justice in Flint, Michigan, and Cabañas, El Salvador is deeply connected to the broader environmental justice movement that began in the early 1980s in the US. And the environmental justice movement, I think, provides a crucial framework to understand and address the challenges faced by communities in Flint and Cabañas in El Salvador. This movement emerged from grassroots protests against environmental hazards in marginalized communities in the US and has evolved to address systemic inequalities and inequities globally. So, starting from Warren County, North Carolina, against a hazardous waste landfill in a predominantly African American community, the environmental justice movement began in the early 1980s with protests and is still very active. And so, here are just a few of the timeline elements and achievements, milestones of this particular movement that are important to address. With the first report, for example, being a groundbreaking study, which revealed that communities of color were disproportionately located near hazardous waste facilities, highlighting the systemic nature of environmental hazards faced by marginalized communities. So it really brought to light the intertwining of racial and environmental injustices, setting the stage for increased public and academic scrutiny. Through the 92 report of the Environmental Equity Work Group, this marked the first official recognition of environmental inequities, emphasizing the need for a comprehensive approach to environmental justice. It heightened public concern and academic interest in how environmental policies disproportionately affect marginalized communities. And then, of course, thinking about the government response, continued efforts, it would be important to, of course, mention the 93 hearings where the House Committee on Civil and Constitutional Rights held the first hearings on environmental justice, elevating the issue to the national policy agenda and demonstrating the need for legislative action. The response to this pressure, various bills aimed at addressing environmental justice were introduced, reflecting increased demand for policy reform, but many of these proposed bills failed to pass. As such, the EPA established an Office for Environmental Justice and a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council in the US to better address environmental justice issues by integrating community perspective into federal policies. And signed by President Bill Clinton, the Executive Order 12898 in 1994 Also, the landmark directive mandated federal agencies to consider environmental justice in the regulations and decision-making processes, significantly influencing state policies and federal actions. So most of these achievements, these milestones have happened in the US territory. But of course, environmental justice, again, it's a much global issue. And so, for example, organized by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, the summit in 1991 was a defining moment for the environmental justice movement everywhere. It emphasized grassroots leadership and the rights of communities of color, in particular, highlighting the scope of environmental justice concerns and building solidarity among diverse communities affected by environmental justices. So each step in this timeline reflects a growing commitment to address the disproportionate impacts of environmental hazards on marginalized communities and underscores the ongoing need for advocacy and systemic reform. So these are some of the elements, some of the principles of environmental justice that are really important in terms of ecological unity. We have key aspects such as recognizing that ecological health is interconnected with human health and social equity. Also, we have to stress the need for proactive measures to prevent ecological harm and effective remediation of existing environmental damage. And finally, the principle of ecological unity also encouraged the active involvement of affected communities in decision-making processes related to environmental policies and practices. So what are examples of ecological unity, which, as it says here, affirm the right to be free from ecological destruction? For example, advocacy for policies that prevent deforestation and protect natural habitats, initiatives to clean up polluted rivers and restore affected ecosystems, support for sustainable agricultural practices that avoid harmful chemical use. In terms of work safety, ensuring a safe work environment, for example, key aspects, of course, include health and safety standards, including proper training, protective equipment, regular inspections, but also the right to safe workplaces because workers should not be exposed to dangerous conditions, including exposure to toxic substance, unsafe machinery, or extreme environments. And finally, one last aspect of worker safety, there's also worker empowerment, because it is necessary to support workers' right to report unsafe conditions without fear of retaliation. And so, what could be examples of how worker safety as a principle within the framework of environmental justice work? For example, implementation of strict safety protocols in industries such as mining, manufacturing, and agriculture, and establishment of safety committees that include worker representatives to address workplace hazards and promote safety. The third principle, the government accountability one, of course, includes aspects such as transparency and responsiveness, demanded in government decision-making processes, but also the recognizing that environmental justice issues are part of human rights, emphasizing the access to healthy environment and as a fundamental right, and also advocating for the reform of laws and policies to ensure they promote environmental justice and protect vulnerable communities. So what could be examples of government accountability relevant in the framework of environmental justice? For example, holding public hearings and consultations to involve affected communities in environmental decision-making processes, providing legal recourse and compensation for communities harmed by environmental justices. So here we have a long list, I realize. It's about 17 points. I didn't include one, which is the one of personal choices, which encourage making environmentally healthy personal choices within the framework of environmental justice. So these are the main ones. These are like subcategories, and I think by the name of them, it's pretty clear what they imply, but it was an interesting exercise for me, for example, to consider how all these principles are applicable to the cases of El Salvador and Michigan, with, for example, Mother Earth and sustainable use, which in El Salvador are important as the country struggled with mining-induced water contamination, which reflect a failure to protect ecological unity and ensure sustainable resource use? Or what about the mutual respect, where the fight against mining practices and for clean water embodies a demand for fair and non discriminatory environmental policies? Of course, another principle that apply to El Salvador would be universal protection and cessation of toxins, with activist efforts to end harmful mining practices align with the principles of this kind. And in terms of Michigan, the case of Flint, again, we can consider the importance of the principle of equal participation and how the Flint water crisis highlighted the need for inclusive decision making processes involving affected communities. Education and informed consent, as the Flint crisis also spurred educational initiatives and discussions on the need for informed consent regarding public health and environmental policies, as well as the principle of self determination. The push for reform and accountability in Michigan, in fact, reflects a community right to make decisions about its environmental health and governance. So, in both case studies, the principles of environmental justice serves as a framework to understand and address the challenges faced by affected community, and they highlight the need for systemic change, greater accountability, and more equitable policies to ensure environmental and social justice. So, of course, there are more current updates. As post 2017, the mining ban, the organization in El Salvador continue their advocacy efforts and they focus on ensuring the enforcement of the mining ban and addressing ongoing water pollution from other sources, for example, sugarcane monocrops. There have been efforts to introduce new legislation focused on protecting water resources and promoting sustainable development. In, a, in the past, there have been also discussion to include the right to water as a human right in the actual constitution of El Salvador. Unfortunately, this initiative has not been successful yet. And so El Salvador continued to receive support from international organizations and NGOs focused on environmental justice and water protection, as this partnership try to facilitate funding for local projects and provide technical expertise for improving water management practices. In terms of water justice in Michigan, Flint, what is happening right now? Efforts to address the water crisis continue with a focus on long term recovery and infrastructure improvement. The city has been working on replacing lead service lines, upgrading water treatment facilities to ensure safe drinking water, but also, of course, programs have been established to monitor and address health issues related to lead exposure, including support services for affected residents and initiatives aimed at reducing lead poisoning. Also, the Michigan Safe Drinking Water Act was updated to strengthen regulations on lead and copper levels in drinking water, and local organizations like Flint Residents for Public Education and the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition continue to play a crucial role in advocating for affected communities, partnering, for example, with research institutions and NGOs to conduct studies to better understand the long term impact of the Flint water crisis. And so these recent updates underscore the ongoing nature of water justice challenges and the importance of sustained effort to address them. By learning from these examples, from these lessons, working together, we can continue to advance water justice goals and contribute to broader global efforts as there are many other areas and communities in the world that suffer from similar issues. And so, just to recap, as we're leading to the end of this discussion, we talked about many things today: the importance of water justice, and how, in the context, the setting was El Salvador and Michigan, two areas that are quite distant from each other, that are quite different, but indeed, there are some parallels that we can draw, common struggles and shared themes that we highlighted. And the second part of the discussion was mostly focusing on grassroots movements and community responses, as activism was and is vital, in both areas, with organization and grassroots movements fighting for immediate relief and working toward long-term systemic changes. We also talked about lessons and strategies as part of a collaborative opportunities, which can amplify voices and advance global water justice. And so thinking about, for example, how the future look like through technological solutions such as innovative weather purification, smart water management system, these technologies can monitor water quality, manage resources more effectively, and they're being developed to provide cleaner water in affected areas. But also, not only from a technological solution point of view, thinking of emerging innovations, what about community based solutions? For example, rainwater harvesting, which implement the rainwater collection system in vulnerable communities to reduce dependency on polluted sources and improve local water security, as well as the use of eco-friendly structure, that is, constructions of green infrastructure such as wetlands and bioswales to manage stormwater runoff and reduce contamination. And finally, thinking about dimensions of inclusive water governments and water justice frameworks as part of policy innovations, thinking about new models for involving marginalized communities in decision-making processes to ensure their needs and perspectives are incorporated into water management policies. The development of this comprehensive framework must integrate environmental, social, and economic consideration to address water justice holistically. And so, in this direction and opportunities, international water justice alliances and the formation of global networks can help support cross-border collaboration and share best practices to address water justice challenges. In terms of equitable water pricing, exploring pricing models that ensure affordability for low-income communities while encouraging sustainable water use is also of great importance. For example, thinking about universal access initiatives and efforts to ensure that all communities, particularly those in marginalized regions, have access to clean and safe drinking water. And finally, global awareness campaigns, as in the case of raising awareness about water justice issues on international scale, mobilizing global support in action, necessarily also involve youth engagement through education programs and youth-led initiatives to foster the next generation of environmental leaders. So really, considering our role in advancing water justice, the way we contribute to effort aimed at ensuring clean, accessible water, every action, big or small, contribute to a broader movement for justice and equity. So I want to thank you once again for your attention today. And so I appreciate the time spent discussing water justice, water rights, water crisis. And I think it's time now to open the floor for further questions or need for more information, especially as we've been discussing many points today. So I'm eager to hear what you think, and if you have particular questions to ask me, I will be more than happy to answer your doubts. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Giada. Questions?
You mentioned the use of indigenous knowledge in the El Salvador case. Could you please give us an example of that indigenous knowledge?
John, would you mind also repeating the question? Sorry, because the audio is not too great from my side.
Oh, sure. If you could repeat the question.
Okay. You mentioned the use of indigenous knowledge in El Salvador in solving the problem. Could you please give us an example of that indigenous knowledge?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for this question, especially considering that El Salvador, compared to many other countries in Central America, has a relatively reduced indigenous population. Unfortunately, there's been the objective of the government in El Salvador in 1932. So, how does it look like? Bearing in mind again that the percentage of indigenous people is very small in El Salvador, and oftentimes they recognize themselves as indigenous through a self-identification process. There's a few organizations. One is, for example, the Asociación Comunitaria Unida por el Agua y la Agricultura. So that would be Community Association United for Water and Agriculture, where they collaborate with the indigenous communities, indigenous groups, we should say, with through reforestation of native species to prevent soil erosion, and the construction of traditional water retention structures. I didn't mention during my presentation, but El Salvador is one of the most deforested countries in the Americas, I think only followed by Haiti. And so, of course, the reintroduction, reforestation with native species is an important method, including more traditional ecological knowledge to address water justice issues. The other organization that I mentioned during my presentation, which is ADES, the Association for the Economic and Social Development in Cabañas, has been really involved in defending water rights and promoting sustainable practices in the department, particularly in areas affected by mining activities. And so the way they've been discussing the use of rainwater harvesting systems in rural communities has been mostly by using traditional methods of water storage and purification. So those are some of the ideas that they work with. And finally, I could mention also the Salvadoran Center for Technology, where they have been collaborating more closely with rural communities. Again, as I said before, usually the indigenous component is mostly through self-identification by using traditional plant-based filtration methods to purify water. For example, they use native plants, locally available plants, known for their nature filtration properties, and they also, of course, combine with modern techniques, being the Salvadoran Center for Technology, to improve efficiency and effectiveness. So these are some of the examples. And again, I think it's interesting to also consider how the few indigenous people left in El Salvador are also considering themselves indigenous. How they interact with local and international NGOs in these projects that are meant to safeguard water in terms of both access and quality.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Any other questions?
Take us home.
I think that's it. So thank you very much. We enjoyed your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you.